The Pope's first love came to the Vatican and dared to ask the unthinkable. Pope Matteo was loved by millions. From the sweeping plazas of Rome to the humblest villages in distant lands, his name was whispered in reverent prayer. Yet in the quietest corners of the apostolic palace, he walked alone. Every morning, before the sun touched St. Peter's dome, the Holy Father slipped away from his attendants. The Swiss guards knew better than to follow. This ritual was sacred, perhaps more sacred than the ceremonies that filled his days. In a small, secluded garden where ancient olive trees twisted toward heaven, Pope Matteo would sit. Rosary beads sliding through weathered fingers, eyes lost in a sky that held no answers. The marble saints watched over him, their stone faces knowing what the world did not. That beneath those immaculate white robes beat the heart of a man who had sacrificed more than most could imagine. His chambers told the story no journalist had ever captured. Ornate gifts from presidents and kings cluttered the shelves. Golden crucifixes, jeweled reliquaries, first editions of theological texts. Yet not a single photograph adorned his bedside. No family portraits. No childhood memories frozen in time. The walls of his private rooms were as bare as a monk's cell, save for a single watercolor of the Italian coastline, Liguria, where the mountains tumble into the sea. "Your Holiness," his attendants would say, "perhaps something more personal for your quarters?" He always smiled, that gentle smile that comforted millions. "The church is my family," he would answer. "What more could I need?" But at night, when the vastness of the papal apartments swallowed even the distant sounds of Rome, Matteo would sometimes stand at his window, one hand pressed against the cool glass, eyes searching the stars as if looking for permission to remember. 50 years had passed since Sophia. 50 years since her tears had fallen on his hands. 50 years since promises whispered beneath a pergola draped in wisteria. She was the only chapter of his youth he never reread, not even in prayer. A choice was made, a final kiss, a tear-stained goodbye, and then silence. Celibacy, service, sacrifice. The cardinals who elected him never knew about the girl with eyes like summer rain. The faithful who kissed his ring never felt how his hands trembled at certain Italian folk songs that floated from cafe windows. His legacy would be written in encyclicals and papal bulls, in diplomatic triumphs and theological insights, not in the secret language of a love surrendered for a higher calling. "We all serve in our own ways," his spiritual director had told him decades ago. "Some sacrifices are visible to all, others are known only to God." And so, Pope Matteo had given himself fully to the Church. He had walked with kings and comforted the dying. He had faced down dictators and embraced the forgotten. His compassion knew no borders. His wisdom transcended politics. The world saw a holy man unburdened by earthly attachments, pure in his devotion, undistracted in his mission. What they didn't see were the moments when, passing a young couple in St. Peter's Square, his blessing would falter for just a heartbeat. Or how, when visiting his hometown near Milan, he always took a different route to avoid a certain cafe where promises had once been made over cups of bitter espresso. But time is a merciful teacher. The sharp edges of regret had smoothed into something almost like peace. Sophia had become less a woman of flesh and blood and more a symbol of what he'd surrendered for his vocation. Or so he told himself in those pre-dawn hours beneath the olive trees. That Tuesday began like any other. Morning prayers, a meeting with visiting bishops, a blessing for pilgrims from Argentina, the familiar rhythm of a life lived in service. Then came the moment that sliced his carefully constructed world in two. As he returned from a private mass, a young Swiss guard approached. The man's face revealed nothing. They were trained that way, but something in his hesitation made Matteo pause. "Your Holiness," the guard said, voice carefully neutral, "forgive the interruption." The guard glanced around to ensure they were alone in the corridor, then handed him a folded piece of paper. Not official Vatican stationery, just a simple white square, the kind sold in any Roman convenience store. "This was brought to the gate, Holiness." The messenger was. The guard chose his words carefully. "Most insistent it reach you personally." Pope Matteo took the note, not at his dismissal. Only when the guard's footsteps had faded did he unfold the paper. 5 words written in rushed handwriting: Sophia Rinaldi. At the gates. His heart stalled, not in fear, but in recognition. Her name felt like a candle relit in a cathedral long abandoned. Half a century dissolved in an instant. The corridor, the Vatican, his very life seemed to recede as though viewed through the wrong end of a telescope. Sophia, here, the man who counseled millions on matters of divine, well, suddenly had no idea what to do next. Sophia Rinaldi was at the gates, and with those 5 simple words, the past had come to collect its due. The small chapel was ancient, dating back to the time of Gregory the Great. Tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Apostolic Palace, it had become Pope Matteo's refuge when he needed solitude beyond what even his private chambers could provide. Few knew of its existence. Fewer still had reason to enter. It was here he asked to meet her. No formal audience hall with its imposing throne. No official reception room with aides hovering nearby. Just this tiny sanctuary where Byzantine mosaics gleamed dully in the light of votive candles. No witnesses except the saints in the frescoed ceiling, their expressions inscrutable as they gazed down on what was about to unfold. Matteo arrived first, dismissing his secretary with instructions not to be disturbed. Then he simply waited, hands clasped to hide their trembling, wondering if he would recognize her. When the door finally creaked open, he didn't turn immediately. He heard soft footsteps on ancient stone, the rustle of fabric, the slight catch in breath that he somehow knew, despite the decades, belonged only to her. Matteo, not Your Holiness, not Holy Father, just Matteo. And in that moment, his title vanished. The weight of the church lifted. For the first time in more years than he could count, he was not Pope, just a man with trembling hands and forgotten memories suddenly rushing back. He turned. Time had reshaped them both. Her dark hair was now silver, elegantly cropped close to her head. Fine lines mapped her face, laugh lines around eyes that had always smiled easily, deeper furrows across her brow that spoke of hardships he knew nothing about. She was thinner than he remembered, her once soft curves now giving way to the angularity of age. But her eyes, those eyes that had once looked at him as though he held all the answers, hadn't changed at all. Sophia, he said, and was surprised by how easily her name passed his lips after so long unspoken. She stood just inside the doorway, a simple black dress lending her dignity without ornament. In one hand, she clutched a worn leather handbag. The other hung at her side, fingers curling and uncurling as if seeking something to hold. "I never thought I would see this place," she said softly, glancing around at the chapel. "Were you like this?" Something in her voice made him look closer. Behind the composed exterior, he saw now what he had missed at first glance, a pallor beneath her olive skin, a slight hollowness to her cheeks, a weariness that went deeper than age. "You're unwell," he said. Not a question. Sophia smiled faintly. Direct as always. "Yes, cancer. It started in the breast, then decided to tour my entire body." She attempted a light tone, but her fingers tightened on her handbag. "The doctors give me months. Maybe less." Matteo felt his throat constrict. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be. I've had a good life. Not the one we once whispered about under the stars, but a good one." She took a step closer. "I wouldn't have come, Matteo. All these years, I've respected your path. I watched from a distance as you rose through the church. I stood in crowds when you became cardinal. I wept with joy and other emotions I can't name when white smoke announced you as pope." She paused, swallowed hard. "I never wanted to disrupt what you've built, what you've become, but circumstances have." Her voice faltered slightly, forced my hand. Something in her hesitation sent a chill through him. This wasn't a deathbed reconciliation, not a final goodbye between old lovers. There was something else, something that had compelled a dying woman to approach the gates of the Vatican and demand to see the Pope. "Why now, Sophia?" he asked gently, motioning for her to sit on one of the small wooden pews. "After all this time." She lowered herself carefully, placed her handbag on her lap like a shield. "I didn't come for closure, if that's what you're thinking. Some things can never close." Sophia looked down at her hands, once young hands that had caressed his face, now veined and spotted with age. "I came because I'm dying," she continued, "but I didn't come for myself." She looked up, meeting his gaze with sudden intensity. "I came for someone else. Someone who needs you more than I ever did." Matteo felt a shift in the air of the chapel, as if the saints above were leaning closer to hear what came next. "Our son." The words floated like smoke in the sacred space, unreal, impossible. Matteo stared at her, certain he had misheard. Our what? The question emerged as barely a whisper. Sophia's composure cracked then, tears filling her eyes. Our son, Gabriel. He's 49 years old now. The candles flickered as Matteo sank onto the pew opposite her, legs suddenly unable to support him. That's not possible. We never. I was pregnant when you left for seminary, she interrupted. I didn't know it then. By the time I realized, you had already taken your first vows. You were so certain of your calling, so dedicated to the path ahead. Her voice grew firmer. I made a choice, Matteo. I chose not to burden you with it, not to make you choose. The chapel spun around him. A son, his son, a person who had walked the earth for nearly 50 years, carrying his blood, his legacy, unknown, unacknowledged. Why didn't you tell me? The words scraped his throat like broken glass. Would it have changed anything? Sophia asked quietly. Would you have left the church? Or would you have carried that knowledge like a stone in your heart all these years, unable to be the father he needed? Matteo had no answer. The truth of her words struck him with the force of revelation. But now? Why tell me now? He managed to ask. Sophia opened her handbag then, removed a photograph, and handed it to him with trembling fingers. Because of who he is. And what will happen to him when I'm gone? The photograph showed a middle-aged man with Matteo's height, Sophia's eyes, sitting in what looked like a garden. But there was something different in his posture, something distant in his gaze that seemed focused on something no one else could see. Gabriel is special, Sophia said softly. Brilliant in ways that defy explanation, but lost in a world that frightens and confuses him. Autism, the doctors finally called it, though it took years to get the diagnosis. Her voice caught. He's never spoken a word, Matteo? Not one. He communicates through art, beautiful, haunting drawings that seem to come from another realm entirely. She reached for his hand then, the first touch in 50 years, and the contact sent electricity through his aged bones. For decades, I've cared for him, protected him, built a world where he could thrive in his own way. But now, tears spilled freely now. Who will love him when I'm gone? Who will understand his silences? Who will keep him safe in a world that has no patience for those who are different? And then, as the weight of understanding dawned on him, Sophia spoke the words that would shatter the foundations of his life. If you cannot save me, she whispered, the plea of a dying mother, please save him. The unthinkable request hung in the air between them, a prayer no pope could grant, yet one this father could not refuse. In the silence that followed, Pope Matteo, Vicar of Christ, successor to St. Peter, leader of billions, faced the most impossible choice of his life. And for the first time since taking his vows, he had absolutely no idea what God wanted him to do. The Vatican guest quarters were never meant for long-term stays. Diplomats, dignitaries, visiting clergy, they came and went like seasonal tides, leaving little trace of their presence. But now, in a modest suite nestled away from the main corridors, Sophia and Gabriel Rinaldi had taken up residence. A temporary arrangement, Matteo had explained to his bewildered staff. A personal matter of the utmost discretion. Pope Matteo stood in the narrow hallway outside the sitting room, his white cassock luminous in the dim light. Through the partially open door, he could see a man, his son, sitting by the window, rocking gently back and forth. Gabriel's fingers traced invisible patterns on the glass, his eyes fixed on something beyond the manicured Vatican gardens. Matteo's faith had weathered many storms, wars, scandals, personal loss, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. This quiet ache of watching a person made from his own flesh and blood, yet utterly unknown to him. He stepped into the room. The rustle of his robes seemed thunderous in the stillness. Gabriel didn't turn, didn't acknowledge him in any way, just continued his rhythmic rocking, continued tracing patterns only he could see. Sophia sat in a corner armchair, her thin frame nearly swallowed by the cushions. Her eyes met Matteo's, a silent conversation passing between them. The pain between them was old, familiar. But this new pain, the shared grief of what their son had missed, what they had all missed, that was fresh and raw as an open wound. He's been like this since we arrived, Sophia said softly. The change in routine, it's difficult for him. Matteo moved further into the room, careful to keep his movements slow, deliberate. He'd spent the night before reading everything he could find about autism, medical journals, personal accounts, therapeutic approaches. Knowledge had always been his refuge. But no amount of reading could prepare him for this reality. "May I sit with him?" he asked. Sophia nodded. "Just don't expect anything. And don't touch him without warning. Sudden contact can be overwhelming." Matteo lowered himself into a chair beside Gabriel. Up close, the resemblance was startling. The same high forehead that Matteo saw each morning in the mirror, the same strong jaw. But Gabriel's eyes were Sophia's, deep brown with flecks of amber when the light caught them just so. "Hello, Gabriel," he said quietly. "My name is Matteo." No response. Not even a flicker of recognition. What had he expected? A miracle? Some divine moment of connection? The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who represented God's presence on earth, unable to reach his own son. "I've brought something for you," Matteo said, reaching slowly into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box, intricately carved with vines and leaves. It was made by monks in Assisi. He placed it on the windowsill within Gabriel's line of sight. Then, with deliberate movements, he opened the lid. Inside, a tiny carved bird rested on a spring. When the box moved, the bird seemed to flutter as if taking flight. Gabriel's fingers paused in their tracing. For just a moment, his rocking slowed. "It's a nightingale," Matteo explained, his voice catching. "They sing most beautifully at dusk." Gabriel's eyes flickered toward the box, then away again. His fingers resumed their patterns, but slower now, less urgent. In that small gesture, that momentary pause, Matteo felt something shift inside him. Not the connection he'd hoped for, perhaps, but something. A beginning. He sat in silence then, watching his son, learning the rhythm of his movements, the pattern of his breathing. What must it be like, he wondered, to live in Gabriel's world? To see what he saw? To feel what he felt? The minutes stretched into an hour. Sophia dozed in her chair, exhaustion from her illness evident in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Matteo remained, simply being present, offering what little he could, his time, his attention, his acceptance. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, Matteo heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. A sharp knock at the door jolted Sophia awake. "Your Holiness," came the urgent voice of Cardinal Bellini, his closest advisor and friend for 30 years. "A word, if you please." Matteo rose reluctantly. "I'll return soon," he promised Sophia, though his gaze lingered on Gabriel. In the hallway, Bellini's normally composed face was etched with concern. "The Curia is asking questions, Matteo. Your absence from this morning's meeting, the presence of these guests." He lowered his voice. "Who are they? Why have they been given accommodations usually reserved for visiting heads of state?" How to explain? How to compress 50 years of silence, of sacrifice, into words that wouldn't shatter the foundation of his papacy? "They are," Matteo began, then faltered. "Sophia is an old friend. From before my time in the church. She's dying, Alessandro. Terminal cancer." Bellini's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that. But surely there are better facilities. And the man with her is her son," Matteo continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Her son, who is also mine." The words hung between them like smoke. Bellini's face drained of color. "That's not possible," he said finally. You couldn't have. It was before seminary. Before my vows," Matteo explained. "She never told me. Never interrupted my path to the priesthood." Bellini leaned against the wall as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear standing. "Does anyone else know?" "Only you. And that's how it must remain." Matteo, Bellini's use of his given name, rare even in private, underscored the gravity of the moment. "You can't walk away from the chair of St. Peter for this. The church needs you. The faithful need you." Matteo's eyes flashed with an intensity that Bellini hadn't seen in years. "And what would the chair of St. Peter mean?" he whispered fiercely. "If I abandoned the only soul I was truly meant to father?" "You have a responsibility." "Yes," Matteo interrupted. "Perhaps for the first time in 50 years, I'm beginning to understand exactly what that responsibility is." Bellini studied his friend's face, the set of his jaw, the steel in his eyes, and recognized that the matter was settled, at least for now. "I'll make your excuses for today's meetings," he said finally. "But Matteo, this cannot remain secret forever. And when it emerges, as it inevitably will, the consequences. Matteo nodded, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders like a cross. I understand. But for now, give me time. Time to know him. Time to. He couldn't finish the thought. After Bellini departed, Matteo returned to the sitting room. Sophia had moved to sit beside Gabriel, her frail hand resting on the table near his, not touching but present. The wooden box sat between them, open, the carved bird catching the last golden rays of afternoon sun. Matteo was torn in two. He had led nations through moral storms, counseled kings through crises of faith. Yet here, in this quiet room, he couldn't even take his son's hand. That night, after Sophia had retired to her bedroom, Matteo remained with Gabriel. He spoke softly, telling stories of his childhood in northern Italy, of the olive groves and vineyards, of the small chapel where he'd first felt God's call. He spoke not knowing if Gabriel heard or understood, but needing to offer something of himself, some bridge across the decades of absence. As the clock struck midnight, Gabriel's eyes finally met his, a fleeting contact that sent a shiver through Matteo's aged heart. Then Gabriel rose, moved to a desk in the corner, and began to rock again, this time with more urgency. Sophia had left materials there: paper, colored pencils, pastels. Gabriel's fingers reached for a blue pencil and began to move across the page in swift, sure strokes. Matteo watched, transfixed, as an image emerged. Not a clear picture, nothing so literal, but a swirl of color and line that somehow conveyed more emotion than any realistic rendering could. And as Gabriel worked, Matteo began to hum, an old Italian lullaby his own mother had sung to him. The melody drifted through the room like incense, its cadence matched to Gabriel's movements. For just a moment, so brief Matteo might have imagined it, Gabriel's head tilted slightly toward the sound. That small, barely perceptible movement became the first fragile string of connection between father and son, a whisper of possibility in the vast silence that had defined their relation. "I'm here," Matteo whispered, though he knew Gabriel wouldn't respond. "For whatever time remains, I'm here." The rhythm of Vatican life bent around the presence of Sophia and Gabriel like a river around a stone. Weeks passed, marked by the steady deterioration of Sophia's health and the slow, halting steps toward connection between father and son. By day, Pope Matteo maintained his public duties, audiences with dignitaries, blessing the faithful who gathered in St. Peter's Square, addressing the pressing issues of the church. But each night, as darkness fell over Rome, he would slip away to the guest quarters where his son waited. Sophia had moved to a hospital bed in the sitting room, no longer able to make the short journey between bedroom and common area. Her doctors came and went, their faces growing more somber with each visit. They spoke in hushed Italian, unaware that their patient had once made the Pope's heart race beneath a wisteria-covered pergola. "You don't need to be here every night," Sophia told Matteo as he settled into what had become his customary chair beside Gabriel. "The world needs you more than we do." But Matteo shook his head. "The world has had me for 50 years. I think perhaps it's time I belonged to someone else for a while." That night, as on many nights before, Matteo read aloud to Gabriel, a ritual that had evolved organically between them. He had discovered that certain texts seemed to calm Gabriel's more agitated moments, poetry especially, with its rhythm and cadence. "The world is charged with the grandeur of God," Matteo read from Hopkins, his voice low and measured. "It will flame out, like shining from shook foil." Gabriel sat in his usual spot by the window, rocking gently, his fingers moving in those enigmatic patterns. At first glance, he appeared not to be listening at all, but Matteo had learned to notice the subtle signs. How the rhythm of Gabriel's rocking sometimes matched the meter of the poetry, how his fingers would pause at particularly resonant passages. And though the last lights off the black west went, "Oh, morning, at the brown brink eastward, springs." As Matteo finished the poem, Gabriel suddenly hummed, a single, sustained note that seemed to pick up where the words left off. Sophia's eyes widened, her gaze moving from son to father. "He's never done that before," she whispered. Not with poetry. Matteo felt something warm unfurl in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his ordination. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper still. "The Hopkins speaks to him," Matteo said softly. perhaps because it speaks of light and darkness. Night after night, they continued this way, Matteo reading, Gabriel listening in his own manner. Sometimes Sophia would join in, her voice growing weaker but her memory of beloved texts still sharp. In those moments, they formed a strange trinity, mother, father, son, united not by conventional bonds, but by something just as sacred. One Wednesday evening, after the bells of St. Peter's had tolled 9, Matteo arrived to find Gabriel more agitated than usual. His rocking was faster, more erratic. The pencils and papers that usually absorbed his attention lay untouched. "He's been like this all day," Sophia explained, her voice thin with exhaustion. "Nothing calms him. It's as if he senses." She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Sophia was failing, faster now, and Gabriel somehow knew. Matteo approached Gabriel slowly, careful not to crowd him. "Would you like me to read tonight?" he asked, knowing there would be no direct answer. Gabriel continued rocking, his gaze fixed on the darkened window where the lights of Rome glimmered like fallen stars. Instead of reaching for the poetry as usual, Matteo found himself humming, the same Italian lullaby he'd hummed weeks before. The melody rose and fell, a simple song his mother had sung to chase away childhood nightmares. Gabriel's rocking slowed incrementally. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, gradually relaxed. Encouraged, Matteo began to sing the words softly, a song about moonlight on the water, about boats sailing safely home. As the final verse faded, he reached out, moving his hand slowly into Gabriel's line of sight, palm upward, an offering, not a demand. Gabriel stared at the outstretched hand for what seemed an eternity. Then, with deliberate slowness, he placed his own hand on Matteo's sleeve. Not quite a grasp, but a touch. No words, just contact. The simple gesture nearly brought Matteo to his knees. "He knows you," Sophia whispered from her bed, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "He always has." Later, when Gabriel had finally settled into sleep on the small cot that had been arranged for him, Matteo sat beside Sophia. The cancer had ravaged her once vibrant body, leaving her a shadow of herself. Yet her eyes remained clear, piercing in their intensity. "I've made arrangements," Matteo said quietly. "For Gabriel. When you—" He couldn't complete the sentence. Sophia nodded. "Tell me." "There's a villa south of Rome. Private. Secure. With staff experienced in caring for adults with special needs. I've already begun the process of transferring ownership to a trust in Gabriel's name." Sophia's eyes widened. "How did you manage that without causing a scandal?" Matteo smiled faintly. "The church has many resources. And many secrets. This will be just one more." "And you?" Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What will you do?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. "What I must," Matteo answered simply. "What I should have done 50 years ago, had I but known." Sophia reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her wasted frame. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. You followed your calling. You've done immeasurable good in this world. If you had chosen differently—" She shook her head. "We can't know what might have been. Only what is." Beyond the window, the dome of St. Peter's glowed in the night, illuminated against the Roman sky. For decades, that sight had filled Matteo with purpose, with certainty. Now, he found himself torn between two vocations, the one he had chosen and the one that had found him despite all odds. The world continued to pull at him. The Curia demanded decisions that only the Pope could make. News of his nightly absences had begun to spread through the Vatican, whispered in corners, wondered about in private chambers. Rumors stirred among the staff. The Holy Father was ill, perhaps, or engaged in some secret diplomatic mission. Matteo found that he cared less with each passing day. The weight of the papal ring on his finger seemed suddenly less significant than the weight of his son's hand on his sleeve. In the weeks that followed, Gabriel began to change in small but significant ways. He started drawing again, not the abstract patterns of before, but images with recognizable forms. Crude, colorful crayon pictures that he would work on for hours, then set aside without explanation. One morning, Matteo arrived to find Sophia holding one of these drawings, her face alight with a joy that momentarily eclipsed her pain. "He's never drawn people before," Sophia explained, her voice trembling. "Not in all these years." Matteo studied the drawing, his vision blurring with unshed tears. What does it mean? Sophia smiled, the expression transforming her ravaged face into something beautiful. It means he sees us, all three of us, together. As she handed him the drawing, their fingers brushed. In that moment of contact, 50 years collapsed like a house of cards. The seminary, the priesthood, the papacy, the estrangement, all of it falling away to reveal a simpler truth. They had loved once, created life together, and now, at the end of Sophia's journey, they had found each other again. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice small. Not of dying, but of leaving him, of not being there when he needs me. Matteo placed the drawing carefully on the bedside table. He won't be alone, he promised. Not ever again. That night, as the three of them sat together in the quiet room, Sophia in her bed, Gabriel at his window, Matteo in his chair, a sense of peace descended that transcended anything Matteo had known in all his years of prayer and devotion. Gabriel began humming, that same, single note that seemed to contain within it all the mysteries of his inner world. Sophia closed her eyes, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And Matteo, Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, Vicar of Christ on earth, found himself thinking not of dogma or doctrine, but of a family he never knew he had, and the immeasurable gift of finding them, even at the 11th hour. The world still pulled at him. The Curia demanded his attention. Rumors swirled. But in that moment, in that room, Matteo was exactly where he needed to be, where God, in his mysterious way, had finally led him. Sophia Rinaldi passed on a quiet Thursday morning in early autumn. It happened exactly as she had wished, not in a sterile hospital room, but in the gentle light of morning, with the sounds of Vatican birds filtering through the partially open window. The majestic dome of St. Peter's was visible from where she lay, its silhouette a final earthly blessing. Matteo was holding her hand when she left, not as Pope, but as the man who had once promised her eternity under a wisteria-covered pergola. He had spent the night in prayer beside her bed, watching as her breathing grew more labored, as the pain medications pulled her deeper into a twilight between worlds. Near dawn, she had opened her eyes with sudden clarity, her gaze finding his with unerring precision. "Matteo," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to tell you." She struggled to form the words, each one a battle against her failing body. He leaned closer, his ear nearly touching her lips. "I'm here, Sophia." "Don't run from him," she managed. "Not again." Her fingers tightened around his with surprising strength. One final surge of the fierce protectiveness that had defined her life as a mother. "I promise," Matteo said, and for the first time in his papal service, he wept openly, unashamed of his human frailty. "I will not abandon him." Sophia's eyes held his as her grip loosened. The smallest of smiles touched her lips before she exhaled one final time, her gaze growing distant, fixed on a horizon only she could see. Gabriel was asleep in his room, mercifully unaware of the exact moment his mother slipped away. But somehow, as if connected by an invisible thread that transcended ordinary awareness, he awoke minutes later. Without prompting, without explanation, he walked to his mother's bedside and stood there, rocking gently, his face inscrutable. Matteo watched as Gabriel reached out, a gesture so deliberate it seemed choreographed, and touched his mother's cooling hand. No tears came, no words, just that simple touch that contained within it a universe of meaning only Gabriel could comprehend. The next 3 days passed in a blur of quiet arrangements. Sophia's funeral was private, no state ceremony, no public acknowledgement. Just a simple mass in the same small chapel where she and Matteo had reunited weeks before. The only mourners were Matteo, Gabriel, Cardinal Bellini, and a handful of nursing staff who had cared for Sophia in her final days. Her body was laid to rest in a small corner of the Vatican gardens, a highly unusual arrangement that had required Matteo to invoke rarely used papal privileges. Her grave marker bore only her name and the dates of her birth and death. No mention of her connection to the Holy Father. No hint of the secret she had carried for half a century. As the last prayers were said and the small gathering dispersed, Matteo remained by the fresh grave, Gabriel standing silently beside him. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the immaculate lawns, painting the scene in shades of amber and gold. In the distance, Tourists wandered St. Peter's Square, oblivious to the private grief unfolding behind Vatican walls. She loved you very much, Matteo said quietly, not knowing if Gabriel could understand or process the concept of death. From the moment you were born until her very last breath. Gabriel made no response, his gaze fixed on the small mound of earth that now separated him from the only constant presence he had ever known. His fingers moved in those enigmatic patterns, tracing shapes in the air that seemed to hold meaning beyond words. That night, in the guest quarters that now felt both emptier and somehow more sacred, Matteo told Gabriel the truth, not in words, for those had never been the language between them, but in presence. He sat beside his son as darkness fell over Rome, one hand resting lightly on the table between them, not demanding contact, merely offering it. Eventually, without warning, Gabriel's hand moved to cover his father's. The touch was brief but deliberate, a connection forged across decades of absence. Then Gabriel began to rock, his body shaking with silent grief. Fingers clutching Matteo's robes, he wept without sound, in the same silence that had defined his life. Matteo held him. For the first time, he embraced his son fully, without hesitation or fear. And there, in the darkness of a Vatican guest room, father and son mourned together, two souls bound by blood and loss and the tentative promise of what might still be. As dawn broke the following morning, Matteo knew what he had to do. The path ahead had clarified during those dark hours of shared grief. A calling as clear and undeniable as the one that had led him to the priesthood 50 years before. He summoned Cardinal Bellini to his private office, not the formal papal study where official business was conducted, but the smaller room adjacent to his personal quarters. "You've made a decision," Bellini said as he entered. "Not a question." Matteo nodded, his face calm, resolved. "I have. The boy. My son," Matteo corrected gently but firmly. "His name is Gabriel." Bellini sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what was to come. "And what of the church? Your responsibilities? The millions who look to you for guidance." "The church has survived for 2,000 years, Matteo said, rising to stand at the window overlooking St. Peter's Square. "It will continue long after I am gone." "But Gabriel, he has only me now." "You're going to resign," Bellini stated flatly, the realization finally dawning. "Yes." The word hung between them, simple yet world-altering in its implications. "There will be questions," Bellini warned. "Speculation. The media will dig until they uncover the truth." "Let them," Matteo replied, surprising them both with his serenity. "I have nothing to hide. Not anymore." That afternoon, Pope Matteo called an extraordinary meeting of the College of Cardinals. They gathered in the ornate consistory hall, their red robes a vivid splash of color against the Renaissance frescoes. Confusion and concern marked their faces. Such hasty assemblies were rare outside times of crisis. Matteo entered without the usual papal fanfare. His steps were measured, his expression serene. As he took his place at the front of the hall, a hush fell over the gathered prelates. "My brothers in Christ," he began, his voice steady and clear. "For nearly a decade, I have had the profound honor of serving as your pope. Together, we have weathered storms both within and without our beloved church. We have sought to bring Christ's message of love and redemption to a world sorely in need of both." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. Men he had worked alongside, prayed with, sometimes disagreed with, but always respected. "Today, I must share with you a decision that I have reached after much prayer and discernment. It is not one I make lightly, but one I make with absolute certainty of purpose." The cardinals leaned forward in their seats, tension rippling through the hall. "I am resigning from the papacy, effective 1 month from today." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. Then came the gasps, the murmurs, the rustle of fabric as cardinals turned to one another in disbelief. Matteo raised his hand, and the hall fell silent once more. "I know this news comes as a shock. You deserve to know why." He stood straighter, his voice growing stronger. "My resignation is not due to scandal. It is not due to health concerns or to any crisis of faith." He took a breath, then spoke the truth he had held close for so many weeks. "For decades, I have served as father to the sons and daughters of God throughout the world. I have counseled, comforted, and guided millions in their spiritual journey. But now, Providence has revealed to me a singular calling, one son who can call no one else father but me. The confusion on the cardinal's faces deepened. Before I entered seminary, before I took my vows of celibacy and service, there was a woman I loved. Unknown to me, when I left for the priesthood, she was carrying my child. Mateo's voice remained steady despite the audible reactions rippling through the hall. She raised our son alone, never interrupting my path to the priesthood, never demanding recognition or support. Now she has passed into God's embrace, leaving behind our son, a man who needs special care and understanding due to the unique way God created him. Cardinal Bellini watched from the front row, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Other faces registered shock, disbelief, even anger. But Matteo continued, his resolve unshaken. Some might view this as a failure, a stain on my vocation. But I have come to see it differently. The world has many shepherds, but this one lost sheep. This soul entrusted to me by both God and the woman who loved me enough to let me go. Matteo spread his hands in a gesture of openness, of surrender. I ask only for your prayers as I embrace this final ministry of my life, not as Holy Father to millions, but simply as Father to one. The debate that followed was heated, passionate. Some cardinals pleaded with him to reconsider. Others suggested arrangements that might allow him to maintain his papal duties while providing for his son. A few voices, older, more conservative members of the Curia, spoke of scandal, of disappointment, of betrayal of trust. Through it all, Matteo listened with the same patient attention he had always given to matters of church governance. But his decision remained unmoved, a rock upon which the waves of argument broke and receded. As the meeting concluded and the cardinals filed out, some offering embraces of support, others maintaining a cool distance, Cardinal Bellini remained behind. "You realize what this means," he said quietly when they were alone. "Everything you've built, all your work, will continue in the hands of whoever the Holy Spirit guides you to elect," Matteo finished. "The Church does not depend on one man, Alessandro. It never has." Bellini studied his old friend's face, searching for doubt or regret. He found none. "You've never seemed more certain," he observed with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. "Because I've never been more certain," Matteo replied simply. "Not since the day I first heard God's call to the priesthood." That night, Matteo returned to the guest quarters where Gabriel waited. His son was sitting by the window as usual, but something was different. On the table before him lay a sheet of paper covered in vibrant colors, another drawing. Matteo approached slowly, careful not to startle him. The drawing showed two figures standing together, one clearly in papal robes, the other smaller, standing close beside him. Between them, floating like a benediction, was a third figure rendered in softer colors, almost translucent in quality. Sophia, watching over them both. "It's beautiful, Gabriel," Matteo said softly. Gabriel didn't respond verbally, he never did, but his rocking slowed, and he pushed the drawing slightly toward his father. An offering. A bridge. Matteo sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "I told them today," he said, knowing Gabriel wouldn't understand the words, but hoping somehow he might sense their meaning. "I'm coming with you. Wherever you go next, I'll be there too." Gabriel's fingers began tracing patterns on the window pane, those mysterious symbols that seemed to connect him to a world others couldn't see. But this time, unexpectedly, his other hand moved to rest lightly against Matteo's arm. In that touch, so tentative, so profound, Matteo felt a blessing more sacred than any he had received in all his years of service. Not the blessing of the Church, with its ancient rituals and formal words, but the blessing of connection, of belonging, of being precisely where he was meant to be. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to toll, marking the hour. Their bronze voices carried across the eternal city, the same bells that had rung when white smoke announced Matteo's elevation to the papacy, the same bells that would soon ring to mark his departure. But in this quiet room, with his son's hand resting against his arm, those bells seemed to speak not of endings, but of beginnings. Not of loss, but of discovery. Not of abandonment, but of coming home. Sophia's last words echoed in his mind. "Don't run from him. Not again." "I won't," Matteo whispered. A promise to the woman he had once loved, to the son he was only beginning to know, and to the God who had somehow, in his mysterious way, brought them all together at last. Not ever again. 6 months had passed since the announcement that rocked the Catholic world. The resignation of Pope Matteo, healthy, beloved, and seemingly at the height of his spiritual influence, had spawned countless theories, from conspiracy to illness to crisis of faith. The Vatican's carefully worded statement about personal matters requiring his full attention had only fueled speculation. But here, in a sun-drenched cafe in the small coastal town of Portofino, where mountains tumbled into the azure Mediterranean, no one paid much attention to the old man and his middle-aged son. The locals had noted their arrival with mild curiosity. Newcomers in the off-season always drew notice, but curiosity had gradually given way to acceptance, then to the warm inclusion that characterized small Italian communities. Matteo no longer wore white. Gone were the ornate robes and ceremonial rings. Now he dressed simply in linen shirts and comfortable slacks, his silver hair trimmed short, his face more tan than it had been in decades. Only his eyes remained unchanged, those piercing blue eyes that had once gazed out from televisions and newspapers around the world. Occasionally tourists would look twice, their expressions shifting from casual interest to dawning recognition. Most respected his privacy. A few approached with hesitant reverence, asking for a blessing that Matteo always gave, though he gently refused any reference to his former title. Just Matteo, he would say. That's all I am now. But he was more than just Matteo to the man who sat across from him at the small cafe table, sketching intently in a worn notebook. Gabriel had changed too in these months away from Rome. His rocking was less pronounced, his moments of agitation fewer. The rhythm of their new life, walks along the shore each morning, afternoons in the small villa gardens, evenings watching the fishing boats return, had given him a stability he had never known in the constantly shifting landscape of doctors and caretakers that had defined his earlier years. He still didn't speak, perhaps never would, but his drawings had evolved, becoming more detailed, more narrative. The local art teacher, convinced of Gabriel's raw talent, had provided better materials and gentle guidance. Now Gabriel's work hung in their villa and in several shops around town, abstract expressions of a mind that experienced the world in ways others could only glimpse. "Is the tea all right?" Matteo asked, motioning to the untouched cup at Gabriel's elbow. Gabriel didn't answer, but his fingers paused in their sketching, a tacit acknowledgement of the question. After a moment, he reached for the cup and took a careful sip before returning to his work. These small exchanges, these microscopic bridges of communication, still filled Matteo with a joy so profound it sometimes threatened to overwhelm him. Every nod, every moment of eye contact, every time Gabriel accepted something offered, each was a miracle more moving than any he had witnessed in his years as Pope. "Buongiorno, Signor Matteo," called Rosa, the elderly woman who owned the cafe. She approached their table with her customary warmth, bearing a plate of freshly baked biscotti. "And for Gabriel, the almond ones you like," she added, though she knew Gabriel wouldn't respond. "Grazie, Rosa." Matteo smiled up at her. "You spoil us." She winked. "Someone should. You two work too hard in that garden of yours." It was a gentle joke between them. The villa garden had become Matteo's passion, a small plot where he coaxed vegetables and herbs from the coastal soil. Gabriel often sat nearby as he worked, sometimes helping in his own methodical way, aligning tools with perfect precision or watering with careful attention to each plant. The rhythm of their days was simple, measured not by consistories or papal audiences, but by sunrise walks and the changing seasons. Yet there was nothing empty about this new life. If anything, Matteo felt more present, more alive than he had in decades. Cardinal Bellini visited occasionally, officially to bring church documents requiring the emeritus pope's consultation, but really to see how his old friend was faring in this self-imposed exile. He always left reassured, if somewhat bemused, by the peace he found in the small villa perched above the sea. "You've created quite a life here," he had remarked during his last visit, watching as Matteo and Gabriel worked side by side replanting herbs for the winter. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Matteo had asked, glancing up from the rosemary he was settling into rich soil. Bellini had gestured vaguely. "Regret, perhaps. Second thoughts. The weight of what you gave up." Matteo had smiled. watching as Gabriel meticulously aligned the small clay pots. I gave up a title, Alessandro. I gained a son. Now, as they sat in the afternoon sunshine, Matteo observed Gabriel's concentrated focus. His son was working on something new, not his usual abstract patterns, but something with more defined shapes. A building of some kind, with a dome and columns. May I see? Matteo asked gently when Gabriel's pencil finally stilled. Gabriel didn't push the sketchbook across the table as he sometimes did. Instead, he carefully tore out the page and handed it directly to his father, a gesture so deliberate it made Matteo's breath catch. The drawing showed St. Peter's Basilica, rendered not with an architect's precision, but with an emotional truth that captured its essence. But the focal point wasn't the grand structure itself. In the foreground stood two figures, clearly meant to be Gabriel and Matteo, hand in hand. "It's beautiful," Matteo said softly, emotion thickening his voice. Gabriel looked up then, his eyes meeting his father's with unusual directness. His lips moved, forming a shape they had never before attempted. "Papa." The single word hung in the sunlit air between them. Not imagined, not misheard. A miracle more profound than any Matteo had witnessed in his decades of service to the church. One word, but the first. Tears spilled freely down Matteo's weathered cheeks. Not tears of sadness or regret, but of profound release. Of grace undeserved but freely given. Of love that had found its way home against impossible odds. Gabriel showed no reaction to his father's emotion. His face remained placid, his eyes already returning to his sketchbook. To him, perhaps, it had been a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement of a truth his mind had already accepted. With hands that trembled not from age but from overwhelming joy, Matteo watched as Gabriel began a new drawing beside the first. This one simpler. A sun rising behind the two figures, its rays spreading across the page in vibrant yellows and oranges. A new day, a new beginning, a new calling. In the months that followed, word spread quietly through the region about the distinguished older gentleman who had settled in their midst. Families with autistic children began to appear at the villa gates, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence as Matteo welcomed them with the same compassion that had once made him beloved by millions. He never claimed expertise, never presumed to have answers. He simply offered what he had learned through his journey with Gabriel, the patient presence, the celebration of small victories, the recognition of different ways of experiencing the divine. One evening, as summer warmth began to soften toward autumn, Matteo and Gabriel sat on their small terrace overlooking the sea. The fishing boats were returning, their lights twinkling against the darkening water like earthbound stars. Gabriel was drawing as usual, his pencil moving with the certainty that characterized all his movements. Matteo sipped his wine, content in the companionable silence they shared. His thoughts drifted back across the months and years, to the solemn majesty of St. Peter's, to the weight of the papal ring on his finger, to the awesome responsibility of shepherding the faith of billions. He had loved that life, had given himself to it fully, without reservation. But watching his son's profile against the sunset glow, he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where God had always intended him to be. Gabriel finished his drawing and, with that same deliberate movement that still made Matteo's heart swell, handed it across the small table. It showed the two of them, sitting exactly as they were now, on the terrace overlooking the sea. But in the drawing, there was a third figure, a woman with familiar eyes, standing behind them, her hands resting lightly on their shoulders. Sophia, present still, in the space between breaths, in the silence between words. She would be proud, Matteo said softly. Of you. Of us. Gabriel didn't respond verbally. That first "Papa" remained his only spoken word, but he nodded, a single dip of his chin that contained volumes. As darkness fell over the Mediterranean, father and son sat together in peaceful silence. Not as pope and faithful, not as caregiver and dependent, simply as two souls connected by blood and choice and love, the most sacred trinity of all. Matteo looked out at the darkening horizon where sea met sky in an indistinguishable line. He had spent decades preaching about surrender, about divine purpose, about trusting in God's plan even when it seemed incomprehensible. Now, in the quiet evening of his life, he finally understood what those words truly meant. He had never stopped being a shepherd. In the small coastal town of Portofino, he continued to guide and comfort, not from the magnificent throne of St. Peter, but from a weathered garden bench, from a cafe table, from the patient spaces between one heartbeat and the next. Not as Holy Father, but as Father, just Father.